Boy and girl are making out, right? When they hear over the radio that this lunatic killer's escaped from an insane asylum.
That's not the way it goes. The boy goes for help, and the girl stays in the car, and she hears this, scratching sound.
No, he's been decapitated.
No, he was gutted with a hook.
When you think of book-to-movie adaptations, I'm sure one of the bigger names that comes to mind is Stephen King.
I'm gonna scare the hell out of you.
We could run a show for years on his adaptations alone, but that would get stale and is also a bit too easy. The inaugural episode took a look at The Thing, and I'm sure a good amount of people knew that that was based on a novella rather than just the 1950s sci-fi classic. Today we're looking at a movie that jumped on the success of Scream and became a hit in its own right. What I didn't know was that I Know What You Did Last Summer was based on a book written over 20 years before the film premiered. Make sure nobody in a fisherman's coat is following you as we find out what the fuck happened to this adaptation.
What are you waiting for, huh?
I Know What You Did Last Summer is a 1997 slasher film written by Scream scribe Kevin Williamson. He actually wrote the screenplay before Scream came out, but found no success with it. Of course, when Scream happened, reinvented the genre, and made a boatload of money, the film was optioned almost immediately by Columbia Pictures and came out a mere 10 months after Wes Craven's film. It was shot in 50 days total and had a who's who of 90s talent in front of the camera. Ryan Phillippe, Jennifer Love Hewitt, Freddie Prinze Jr., and Sarah Michelle Gellar were the core four, with a pre-Big Bang Theory Johnny Galecki, Bridget Wilson, and Anne Heche rounding out the supporting cast. Heche would only appear in 2 scenes, but a crowded 1997 would elevate her already rising star power. This film, Wag the Dog, Volcano, and Donnie Brasco would keep audiences seeing her all year long and led to more roles for years to come. Bridget Wilson had a hell of a run from the early 90s to the early 2000s with classics like Last Action Hero and Billy Madison.
That Veronica Vaughn is one piece of ace.
But also underrated gems like House on Haunted Hills remake and as Sonya Blade in the fun first Mortal Kombat film.
Give it up, baby. I've studied all your moves.
Yeah, study this!
1997 was the year that Gellar broke out with her start as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, as well as a turn in the other Williamson slasher of that year, Scream 2. While he has the least amount of screen time, the movie would also boost Freddie Prinze Jr. to have a strong career in front of the camera before moving to voiceover work, particularly in the Star Wars universe. Phillippe had already appeared in a couple movies and TV shows before his turn as Barry, but like his co-stars, this would give him shots in bigger movies like Cruel Intentions and Studio 54. Hewitt was the biggest name in the group, with a music career already under her belt, and big shows like Party of Five and Kids Incorporated. Her big screen output and run on TV would continue steadily into the mid-2000s. Behind the camera was director Jim Gillespie, and unlike Wes Craven for Scream, Gillespie came and went as a director, with only a handful of theatrical releases after today's film, including a forgotten Sylvester Stallone thriller called I See You from 2002.
I see you. You see this.
Let's be honest though, the real star of this film is writer Kevin Williamson, who became a ridiculous success after Scream came out. He would write Scream 2, The Faculty, Cursed, and Scream 4 for the big screen, while also creating Dawson's Creek, The Following, and the Scream TV series for the small screen. He adapted Vampire Diaries into the Juggernaut TV show, and his sole directorial effort was Teaching Mrs. Tingle, which he also wrote. In fact, Teaching Mrs. Tingle bears a lot of similarities to another Lois Duncan novel, Killing Mr. Griffin. I'm guessing Williamson was a fan. I Know What You Did Last Summer would make $125 million on its $17 million budget. While critics didn't much care for it and called it out for capitalizing off Scream's success, which is kind of funny when you remember that Williamson wrote both films and this film actually before Scream, it was a success nonetheless. I Know What You Did Last Summer was written by Lois Duncan and published in October of 1973. At less than 200 pages, it was written as a teen thriller, or what we call a YA novel now.
How do you do, fellow kids?
While I didn't know it was based on a book, viewers of a certain age were quite fond of it, and the movie adaptation made the novel a smash hit well after it was written. Duncan was an active writer for just under 70 years and wrote nonfiction, full-on novels, poetry collections, had audiobooks, a few children's books, and even edited a couple anthologies. She would drop out of college and had her first book published in 1958 under the pen name Lois Carey. That novel, Love Song for Joyce, would be the beginning of a long-lasting career. While I Know What You Did Last Summer may be her most famous work, she stepped away from horror and thriller after her daughter was murdered in an unsolved mystery in 1989. She wrote a book called Who Killed My Daughter in 1992 and a sequel to that called One to the Wolves in 2013, but it would seem the killing in New Mexico was a sad random act of violence. In August of 2021, however, a suspect was apprehended on seemingly unrelated charges, but later confessed to the murder of Duncan's daughter as well as 2 other killings. Her family would receive justice and closure for the heinous crime, but sadly, Lois herself would pass away in 2016 and not live to see it herself. Other adaptations of her work would be the made-for-TV thriller Summer of Fear, which is actually an early Wes Craven film starring Linda Blair, as well as a handful released just after today's subject in the late 1990s. These include the Dennis Hopper-led Held for Ransom and I've Been Waiting for You with Sarah Chalke and Ben Foster. She was also the author of kids' book Hotel for Dogs, which would get the adaptation treatment from Paramount starring Emma Roberts in 2009. Duncan would take the interesting road and revisit some of her novels to update them with the times. I Know What You Did Last Summer would have cell phones and updated clothing added, as well as having the Vietnam War changed to the war in Iraq. While Duncan was happy and thankful that the movie reignited interest in her novel and made it a bestseller, she absolutely hated the film version and spoke out against it for the remainder of her life. She was not expecting a slasher film, but that's what was popular at the time. She would also lament that once a property is optioned, it's completely out of the writer's hands. Both film and novel revolve around a group of 4 friends who were involved in a terrible accident involving a car hitting a person, and both have those 4 friends trying to avoid blame and consequences for their actions. The characters have the same names in both mediums, as Ray, Helen, Barry, and Julie are the 4 people involved in the initial accident. The plots of both are kicked off when Julie receives an anonymous note saying, "I know what you did last summer," and she goes to warn her friends. In the book and the movie, Helen, Julie, Ray, and Barry are all warned with warning signs or minor pranks, and Barry is seriously injured by who they believe has written the note and knows what they did. 2 of our main characters decide to investigate and visit the family home of the person they killed that night, and are greeted by the sister of the victim. She explains that the family went into disarray after the loss of their other child, and the 2 leave to pass on that information. Helen is chased by the killer, and in the end, it comes down to Ray and Julie versus the person who wrote the note. Well, that previous section was a little light, yeah? The book and the movie have the bare bones of similarities, like character names and overall plot device, but that's kinda it. Starting with what happens as the initial incident, the book is a hit and run of a young boy on a bike, and the group of friends actually call the police about 10 minutes after. Unfortunately, the boy dies on the way to the hospital. The movie sees the friends strike an adult man, and instead of calling the cops or just leaving him, they attempt to dispose of the body. As they attempt to do this, a friend of Julie named Max sees them, but nothing is said between the group. The movie group are all on the same grade level, but in the novel, Helen and Julie are a year younger and still in high school for the story. After Julie gets the note and tells the others, Barry confronts Max, who, doesn't exist in the book, and Max is killed shortly thereafter. Barry is shot in the book, but run over by his own car in the film. Julie has guilt in the book enough to send flowers to the funeral of the boy they killed, and this is how the antagonist finds out it was their group. He tracks the order from the local florist and then follows Julie to Helen and puts 2 and 2 together. While Helen's sister is not exactly a kind person, to say the least in the movie, she's briefly a suspect in the book, and we also see Helen's mother, father, and other siblings. When Julie goes to the home of the boy they ran over in the book, the family is so distraught and the sister explains what happened to them all afterwards. The movie version of the sister gives no insight as to what happened to the rest of the family, and is creepy as all heck, while only mentioning that a friend of the family has come to visit a couple times. Then there's a couple of huge differences between the mediums. First off is the violence depicted in both. The book only has 1 fatality, the hit and run that starts the whole story where the boy dies. The film kills off Max, Helen's sister, a cop, Barry, Helen, and then the main villain. Who the writer of the note and the stalker of the kids changes from page to screen as well. The movie killer ends up being the person they hit with the car in the beginning. His daughter was killed by the younger brother of Anne Heche, and he killed him before being struck by the car. The crew in the film assume it's the young man at first that they killed, but they learn it was the grieving father they almost killed that's after them. The book has a much better mystery behind it as well. The book in general is a much more sleek mystery thriller than the slasher film it became later. Julie in the book ends up dating a character named Bud after Ray goes away and has 0 interest in getting back together with him. Helen has a new guy move into her complex named Collie Wilson as well. Now, not only are Bud and Collie the same person, but he's the older brother of the kid they inadvertently killed. Finally, the ending of the book involves Ray figuring things out after a call from Barry and rescuing Julie from strangulation by hitting Bud/Collie with a flashlight. The two agree after that it's time to go to the police and admit their crimes. The movie sets up sequel bait after killing the hook-wielding bad guy. Julie goes back to college and finds another note, only to have someone crash out of the shower and attack her as we fade to a black screen. While there are a lot more minor differences between the two, these are the ones that make major changes between the source material and its film adaptation. The book is a well-written thriller that has been updated by the author and gets a re-release every time a new major adaptation comes out. It has a great mystery behind it and wasn't just a cash-in on other projects at the time. The film did well, but doesn't stand up next to Scream or even some of the other slashers that came out in the late 90s and early 2000s. It got a direct sequel called I Still Know What You Did Last Summer the next year. That one has a surprisingly fun supporting cast that includes John Hawkes, Jack Black, and Jeffrey Combs, while also adding Brandy and Mekhi Phifer to the returning Jennifer Love Hewitt and Freddie Prinze Jr. It's not great, and while it still made $84 million, it wasn't as much as the first one and cost quite a bit more.
What about the sequel? What the hell's with that fat white Jamaican?
Oh, I want to kill that motherfucker.
Man.
There was a third film called I'll Always Know What You Did Last Summer in 2006 that went straight to video. The less said about that one, the better. Amazon also picked up a show adaptation that just lasted one season in 2021. While the adaptations have more legs than the original novel, and thus the bigger legacy, the novel is a superior work and I highly recommend you give it a go. It's a quick read, and if you like it, Duncan has a ton of other books to look into. Sometimes you find out that your favorite movies were actually adaptations of novels. While everyone knows when they're getting a Stephen King adaptation, a lot of the time you won't know that a movie's based on an existing story until you get hit with it in the credits. Bubba Ho-Tep is one of those properties. All the advertising and certainly the feeling of the movie is that it's a Bruce Campbell and Don Coscarelli movie, but the short story was written by Joe R. Lansdale. The movie was the little indie that was destined for cult fame and make its way to multiple special editions, but it's time to look at its genesis and see where it all came from. Get your words of power and protect your soul as we find out what happened to the adaptation of Bubba Ho-Tep. Bubba Ho-Tep is an independent horror film made by some of the most beloved indie filmmakers of all time. The short story was released in 1994, and director Don Coscarelli had wanted to make it for some time. He knew Sam Raimi, who would introduce him to Bruce Campbell, and after reading the story and knowing Don's work, Bruce had only one question. Are we going to show the penis? If you've seen the movie, you know what we're talking about.
That's the intro to my character in this movie. So, my first instinct was, where do I sign up,
Campbell loved the out there idea and agreed to make the movie. Bruce is one of the most beloved horror stars of all time, and for good reason. In addition to his turn as barely hero Ash Williams in the 3 original Evil Dead movies and the way better than we deserve TV show, he also showed up in the first 2 Maniac Cop movies, and Sundown, A Vampire in Retreat. Of course, there's so much more. Xena and Hercules, personal favorite Briscoe County Jr., Sam Axe, and all of his legendary voiceover work in both video games and cartoon shows. While he may forever be linked to Ash in the Evil Dead, his resume and talent for other genres is limitless. He even directed a couple feature films and multiple TV show episodes. While Campbell's mummy-fighting Elvis is the main attraction, the rest of the cast is perfect and a lot of fun. Emmy-nominated and acting legend Ozzie Davis plays an apparently still alive but died JFK. Campbell jokes in an interview that he used to ask Davis every day what the hell he was doing in this movie, but he was also just the nicest guy apparently. Honestly, if you're willing to suspend your disbelief for Elvis being alive and fighting a soul-sucking mummy, why not JFK too? While Davis was an active actor for over 50 years, he did things he wanted to do rather than what he felt he had to do. He'd show up in prestige projects like Roots and Do the Right Thing, and also pulp like Today's Movies and Avenging Angel. The rest of the cast is rounded out with small parts from Ella Joy as the nurse, Harrison Young as Elvis's roommate, Daniel Roebuck as a hearse driver, and of course Reggie Bannister as the administrator of the rest home in East Texas. I talked about Reggie in my Phantasm 3 video, but he's just a cool hippie that ended up in most of Don Coscarelli's work, as well as a ton of other horror work. While he is and always will be tied to Phantasm, it's always fun to see him show up in things like this or Wishmaster. Coscarelli started his career with writing and directing Jim, the World's Greatest in 1975, where he first worked with both Reggie Bannister and Angus Scrimm. Apart from the Phantasm movies, his careers included the Lance Henriksen starring Survival Quest, and, more relevant to today, as an episode of Masters of Horror, which is also based off a short story by today's author. The only thing that he has coming up is the long-in-development prequel Bubba Nosferatu, and even that's probably never going to happen. The movie had a small budget and only barely made it back, but was a success with critics and audiences, and has been released multiple times, including the coveted 4K. The success is in no small part to Campbell bringing one of the few prints with him on his book tour and showing it off while building word of mouth. I was lucky enough to see it in theaters in Costa Mesa, California, and absolutely fell in love with it. Bubba Ho-Tep was first published in August of 1994. Its first appearance was actually in a collection of Elvis fiction called The King is Dead. Critics thought that Lansdale was too graphic in his writing and considered it the worst or one of the worst stories in the entire collection. The author of the story, Joe R. Lansdale, was born in Gladewater, Texas in October of 1951. This story specifically was inspired by the first time Lansdale saw the original Universal Mummy film and figured that Imhotep would be a Bubba if he ever landed in Texas. Joe started writing and would have his first novel, Act of Love, published in 1981. As for Bubba Ho-Tep, the movie's popularity and proposed sequel would eventually lead Lansdale to writing a follow-up novella called Bubba and the Cosmic Bloodsuckers. There would also be comics that feature Elvis with, who else, Ash Williams teaming up. He would have other works made into TV shows or films, with his longest-running series, Hap and Leonard, being made into a series starring Michael K. Williams and James Purefoy as the titular mystery solvers. While the show would last 3 seasons, the books have 25 entries from 1990 to 2022. Bubba Ho-Tep would actually be his first work to be adapted, but it was followed by the premiere episode of Masters of Horror, Incident on and Off a Mountain Road, with Don Coscarelli directing again. For those of a certain generation, he also wrote a handful of episodes for Batman the Animated Series, or, the greatest cartoon show ever made. He still writes and is still very active with his most recent novel, The Donut Region, being published in 2023, as well as a collection of crime stories also published this year. Literally almost everything is the same here. The story, which is only 36 pages, is followed nearly identical in the film. Both open in a nursing home with an elderly and sick and apparently still alive Elvis Presley waxing philosophically on life, death, fame, and other topics. His roommate Bull dies, and his daughter comes to collect some of the things. She ends up throwing away a Purple Heart and a picture of the man before Elvis chides her for not coming in more, and missing his own estranged daughter. The nurse, who apparently has breasts like grapefruits, patronizes Elvis, and we learn that he switched places with an Elvis impersonator named Sebastian Haff. They had a contract that stated Elvis could go back anytime he wanted to, but the contract was unfortunately destroyed, and Elvis also had an accident while performing a show playing Sebastian playing Elvis. He hurt himself and fell into a coma, and they claim that he came out, well, not all there. Things start to go bad at the retirement home when Elvis hears something at night. He goes to investigate and finds the gentleman who claims to be JFK on the floor. JFK explains that they took a piece of his brain and replaced it with sand while also dyeing him black. JFK wakes up Elvis and they discover hieroglyphics on the bathroom wall before actually seeing the mummy, who is terrorizing their little community. They figure out he is a soul sucker who came here from a botched robbery in Bad Storm, and their neighbor known as Kimasabe dies trying to save his roommate. They devise a plan to stop the creature with gasoline and matches late at night, and while they are successful, they both die in the process, but neither has their soul taken. The story, and even much of the dialogue, is taken exactly how it's written in the story. From Elvis's inner monologues to some of the best one-liners, they all come directly from Lansdale's words. The descriptions of the characters, their rooms, where all the action takes place, and the names are all taken from the page directly to the screen. Of course, with the story being only 36 pages, there need to be some additions to make into a feature film. Nothing much was changed. In fact, mostly we were given some new characters and drawn-out scenes to get from a 36-page story to a 90-ish minute film. They kind of swapped a character with a thieving old woman in the movie that doesn't exist in the book, and the sex-changed Dillinger character from the book is nowhere to be found in the film. Reggie Bannister plays an unnamed administrator in the movie for a couple of scenes, and while the white coats are mentioned in the book, there aren't any individual scenes with them in it. The nurse that takes care of Elvis gets more of a personality and an extra scene, with the titular Bubba has quite a few changes. His hat in the book is actually part of the ethereal living shadow that seems to have a mind of its own. In the movie, we get some effects to show his magic, but he actually has a companion scarab beetle that does recon and attacks for him. This is absent from the story, but it does a good job fleshing out his powers and gives Campbell more time to chew the scenery. Finally, while the movie doesn't hold back on the gross sound effects and language, the short story goes above and beyond with language and descriptions of less than pleasant subjects. While the short story is a fun and quick read, the movie was lightning in a bottle that brought together two of the best independent horror filmmakers of all time. Campbell owns the role like it was written expressly for him, and gives Coscarelli a notch on his belt that isn't Phantasm related. The movie didn't make a ton at the box office, but it wasn't widely released either, nor was it expected to, and it continued to gain new fans with each successive release on Blu-ray and 4K. The movie would be watched based on its pedigree, but it's safe to say that the story is now finding new readers because of its movie counterpart. Buy your edition of choice to keep the movie rolling, but don't sleep on Lansdale either. He's a prolific writer that works in enough genres where you're bound to find something you like. Next time you visit an elderly loved one, be sure to check the surrounding area for Ho-Teps, Bubba or otherwise.
Never fuck with the king.